Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture and a continuing nine-part series on Aristotle's virtue ethics. As you can see, this is a list of the different discussions that I've had so far in this lecture series. You can find all of these plus an extra lecture on justice as a virtue in Aristotle on my YouTube page. We've talked about eudaimonia, virtue, we've talked about voluntary action and continence and friendship. And in this lecture, I'm going to be focusing on contemplation, which might seem like a strange thing to us, speaking or living in the 21st century. We're surrounded by, of course, our iPhones and iPads. We have music blaring all the time, movies that we can easily go see. So where does contemplation fit in? Does this even have a discussion for us today? And I'll address that question at the end of this particular lecture. To begin with, though, we want to think about happiness again. And remember that when we're talking about happiness, we're talking about eudaimonia, so we're not talking about an emotion. We're talking about self-fulfillment, living the best life, what in the 70s we might refer to as self self-realization. So happiness for Aristotle is not just it's not a feeling, it's an activity. And the activity is one that is choice-worthy in itself. We choose to do this activity for what it is, not for what it gets us, right? So it lacks nothing and is self-sufficient for Aristotle. Now these are kind of hard, esoteric things to kind of think about when we're thinking about activity, but what he's really talking about is the idea that there's an activity, or maybe a variety of activities, but an activity that really, when we're doing it, we can do it without a lot of extras. We don't need things to do it. And it really lacks nothing. It makes us feel complete in itself. And so Aristotle wants to make an argument that a life of contemplation satisfies this kind of activity. So his argument is fairly straightforward. If happiness is activity expressing virtue, and we've already argued for that in the second lecture, then happiness will express the supreme virtue. So we might not think in terms of supreme virtue. We don't typically make a hierarchy of the kinds of activities that we do. But Aristotle insists that if we're living a virtuous life, and we discussed this in lecture 2 when we talked about the good end of human life, right? That what we're doing is regardless of what the end is, it fits somewhere in a hierarchy for us. If we have an ultimate goal that we're pursuing, all the other ends fit into that. And so Aristotle's talking about virtue, which is our best ability, living a life of deliberation, and the supreme virtue has to be a virtue of the best thing. Well, what is the best thing? As you know from listening to previous lectures, Aristotle wants to base this on his understanding of human beings, right? And so recall that Aristotle is the first person to really categorize things, and he does so by their functions. And so for Aristotle, each living being has a particular function, and the particular function of Homo sapiens, of human beings, is understanding. It's reason, right? And he says this is clear from the fact that whatever seems to be a natural ruler and leader is what is best. Now, there is some hierarchy put in there. There's some ideas of some people who are meant to be natural rulers and some people are meant to be natural slaves, which we get into if we wanted to go talk about the politics. We don't need to get into that kind of discussion to understand where Aristotle's coming from here, right? That the understanding or the virtues associated with understanding, these are the best parts of the human being because everything else is organized around trying to know, trying to learn. And again, we'll come back to whether that's true for all human beings. So understanding, of course, has its own sort of hierarchy. So he says to understand what is fine and divine is better than to understand what is mutable. So being a scientist today is very important, of course. We gain lots of knowledge from science. We've cured diseases. We've made wonderful things where we can fly to the moon. hopefully one day fly beyond the stars. But despite the kind of advantages they have, they're not divine. They're not something that raises us up to the best that we can be. It's the other parts of that, the knowing that comes with it. So if you think about Star Trek, right, the purpose of the Federation in Star Trek is to explore. It's not to have battles with the Klingons or the Romulans, although many of the movies are based on that, but it's to really come to understand the universe. Okay. Uh, so, if understanding is what is best in us, and understanding what is fine and divine is the best kind of understanding, then for Aristotle, complete happiness is an activity expressing this virtue, and he calls this contemplation, right? Uh, so, whether he's talking about someone who sits in the office and just thinks, well, that's not really the kind of idea. He's not talking about angels on a cloud playing a violin. He's talking about an activity of learning and knowing. So it's not just sitting in my office in a chair thinking. It's doing something. It's having an activity of learning and getting to know the world better, getting to know ourselves better. So study is an activity, and it relates to what is best in us for Aristotle. And again, we want to think about, well, what does it mean to say that this study, this thinking is the best in us? Um, what Aristotle has in mind is that thinking is what separates us from all other living beings. Now, of course, we know much more about dolphins and apes and whales today than Aristotle did. But it's true that our type of thinking, which is symbolic, and which we find in the line of hominids, including Neanderthals, this kind of thinking is a particular kind of thinking, a particular kind of activity that no other being that we know of in the universe can do. And so that makes it something very special for us. Okay? And that's the kind of idea that Aristotle is trying to get at here. So this life of contemplation is most continuous, right? I can play basketball until I'm 40, 45. I'm not going to play it well when I'm 45, but I can still play it. But I can think, I can read, I can study until the day I die. For Aristotle, contemplation is the most pleasant, right? Expressing wisdom. So again, there are other activities that we might find to be pleasant, but Aristotle is making the case that learning something new, understanding the universe, is actually more pleasant than those things. It's the most self-sufficient. We can continue to study without other things for a long time. Sure, we might need a book or two, but if we just go out and look at the universe, study the stars, study the trees, plants, and things, this is the most self-sufficient. And I think the most important thing here is that for Aristotle, the life of contemplation aims at nothing beyond itself. The life of contemplation is a life in itself, and it's not for money or for pleasure or for any of these other sorts of things that we might think about. If I play basketball for a living, right, or if I play basketball for joy, it's because it brings me a certain kind of thing. It's not just basketball in itself. For Aristotle, contemplation is done for itself. And so this involves leisure, and we know that what we spend our leisure time doing is in many ways those things that we most value, right? Because it is our leisure time, right? Now, obviously, virtues around politics are important. We have to deal with living in the real world. But if we can spend our time studying and learning about the world, that is far superior to a life of politics. Now, he goes farther than that, right? He says that the life of study is superior to the human life, right? And so there's a part of us that is divine, that is close to what the gods are like. And for Aristotle, the gods are involved in contemplation. So he's moved away from the traditional Greek gods of Zeus and Hera, and he's saying the gods are those divine elements that are contemplating the universe, okay? And when we study, when we work on our understanding, we are focused on that part of ourselves which is the better part, the better element, because it is longer lasting, it is more self-sufficient than other aspects of our human lives. Now, there is a debate in Aristotelian studies. I hinted at this in my last lecture on friendship about whether what is superior, the political life or the life of contemplation. Aristotle begins the Politics by saying that we are political animals, that is necessary for happiness. Here it seems in the Ethics that he's saying that the life of study is more divine, and so he's coming closer to Plato and the idea of the guardians who spend their lives contemplating things in the Republic. But for a great extent, for Aristotle, the life of study, the life of philosophy and contemplation is beyond the merely human. So we need both politics and study. And so my reading of Aristotle is that there's a mixture here, that the good life is one of study and politics. And we see that in relationship to what he says about friendship, right? The reason that friends are necessary for each other is that we enjoy the same things. And so those friendships that we build around knowing the world are the stronger friendships. And that shows that because friendship and politics go hand in hand. And again, we're not talking about the kind of politics that we see in the modern 21st century, that we see with Reagan, that we see with Democrats and Republicans, that we see with Donald Trump. We're talking about a life of trying to decide what is good for us to pursue, right? That's what politics is for Aristotle, and that's part of this friendship that we see in Aristotle. Now, again, I said I would come back to this question. Is this too far-fetched? And I think it's not, right? We are torn. We've got our apps on our phones that we play, games that we play. I got addicted to 2048.com. It was just something that I played, and it actually made me physically sick sometimes to play it, but I kept playing it. We're addicted to television or to music and these sorts of things, and we don't give a lot of value to contemplation, to study. Certainly, philosophy is not one of the hot subjects to study in school these days, even though we see that people who major in philosophy have better jobs, better pay out of school than those who major in STEM. But I want to take a step back. If you've had children, if you had the opportunity to be with children, I'm talking children before they get to school, right? They have a voracious appetite for knowing. I remember taking my daughter on walks, and she would stop and pick up flowers and rocks. All my kids were really interested in studying rocks, and just trying to understand what's going on here. The problem in our society is that education saps the desire to know. And the reason that it saps the desire to know is because in our society we say education is about getting a job. And that's not what Aristotle is talking about, right? That undermines the whole concept of contemplation. So I know it might be hard for us to understand what Aristotle is trying to get at. It might be very difficult for us to say, hey, Aristotle's got a point here, but spend some time with small children. And I think you'll come to an understanding that, Aristotle had some very deep insight about this topic.